So the next presentation is going to be given by Rachel Durbin is going to be giving the presentation, also with Justin Wood and Jeff Lauder. They're from the Sierra Stream Institute in Nevada City, and they're going to talk about spawning bed enhancement.
Hello. Obviously, I am not Justin Wood. This is his project, though, so I'm going to do my best to explain it as completely as possible. And I have Jeff here, who has been on the ground and behind the computer doing a lot of the statistics for this. So between us, hopefully, we can cover this thoroughly and answer any questions that you have. This is covering a spawning bed enhancement project that's been ongoing for a couple of years in Deer Creek in Nevada City. And so I want to say a big thank you to Amy for giving a really wonderful introduction on Chinook salmon and all of their habitat requirements. So where's Deer Creek? We are part of the Greater Yuba watershed. And so you'll see down sort of on the bottom portion, we feed into the lower Yuba after the three forks, the North, Middle, and South Yuba, all convene. And so to zoom in a little bit, we're in Western Nevada County, and we have 18 now actually, long-term monitoring sites on Deer Creek. 14 is at the very bottom, you can see on the very left there. And it is just above where Deer Creek meets the Yuba River. And so these salmon are actually coming up the Yuba River, and Deer Creek is one of the last tributaries that they can access for spawning. And so this is about 4 miles downstream of the Lake Wildwood Reservoir. And the Lake Wildwood Reservoir is holding back the accessible gravels that the salmon can actually use to make their redds. Deer Creek enters the Yuba just a little under a mile downstream of the Englebright Reservoir. And our spawning reach is about 2,100 feet in length, so this is a pretty small section of creek that we're dealing with. Our work spans about 1,400 feet of the creek, and it's located on both private and fish and wildlife land. So the property line runs right down the center of the creek. So one side of the creek we're dealing with fish and wildlife land, the other side we've got a private landowner who's been very helpful in implementation of this project. This is a multi-year augmentation project. It started in 2010. And the goal is to provide suitably sized gravels for spawning Chinook salmon. So between the Lake Wildwood Reservoir and the Englebright Reservoir, there aren't huge amounts of suitably sized cobbles and gravels, particularly in Deer Creek. Englebright was created as a debris dam, and so there are actually suitable sized gravels further down the Yuba left over from hydraulic mining, but Deer Creek does not have that input of gravels into the system. And so this is a pretty historically active Chinook spawning area, and we just want to give a really brief overview in this talk of the methods that we used and some preliminary results in the context of the swamp field methods. Obviously, we're dealing with a much smaller reach than a lot of these areas, so we'd like your feedback to see whether we're actually doing justice to the swamp methods or if there's a better way that we could be getting these analyses taken care of. So we have 3 different work areas as the sites of gravel injection and red creation. So as Amy described, a red is simply a salmon nest or a spawning bed. And so at the bottom of the map is site number 1, and that's actually the site furthest upstream. Site number 2 is in the middle, and site number 3 is at the very bottom, just before the mouth of the Yuba River. And the areas in pink, which are kind of obscured in some of these sections, those are actually the work areas. So we injected clean gravel into these spots that had been washed and was presumably free of any macroinvertebrates or algae. Excuse me. We took intergravel water quality measurements and conducted pebble counts, as well as sampling macroinvertebrates and algae both before and after project implementation. Upstream of Site 1, it's worth noting, is an impassable waterfall. It's a natural waterfall, and so Chinook can't really get a whole lot farther up the creek than they can in our work area. And these are predominantly fall-run Chinook that we're dealing with. So these are just some graphs to sort of show you what the substrate looked like in the creek before and after restoration. And so the red line is the surface gravels, or the surface substrate, and the blue line is the subsurface substrate. And so you can see in the top image, which is pre-implementation, that the distribution is pretty much entirely outside of the habitat range that's preferred by salmon, which is represented by those dashed black lines. And so everything is pretty much too large for them to move. It's also highly embedded, very heavy. And so what these females are dependent upon is gravel size and the velocity of the stream. And so in pre-project measurements, we could see that there's not a whole lot of area actually accessible for them to be building their redds. So after restoration, we see that those numbers have shifted, and now most of the subsurface and surface substrate is actually available for them to be building redds out of. And just for reference, because pebble counts might be a little more familiar to people, and you can see we have bulk samples here. Bulk samples are taken into account both size and weight. So it's actually removing these gravels or bedrock, weighing them, and measuring them. So as of November 27th, 2012, which was when the last survey for redds happened last year, there were more than 51 salmon redds in Deer Creek, and those are indicated by these red dots on the map. And in 2011, just for comparison's sake, we only had 15 redds in the area. In 2003, when we started monitoring, there were only 9. So we can see there's a very substantial increase in use of this area, and we think that's mainly attributed to the fact that they now have substrate they can move and make their redds out of. In analyses last year, we found that about 75% of the spawning activity actually took place in one of the 3 work areas. And the remaining activity was in locations where we observed spawning in 2011, before implementation. So this is indicating that our project objective, which was to create spawning habitat in Deer Creek, was a success, and that the majority of the Chinook are spawning in the enhanced work areas. And so this is just a picture of a female Chinook actually making a redd. So she lays on her side and undulates, uses her tail to dig little divots into the gravel, and then she deposits her eggs, and a male comes and fertilizes them. So we wanted to not only know what is the substrate there, but what is happening in the water within that substrate. And so we did intergravel water quality measurements both before, during, and after restoration. So the September 4th is before any restoration took place. And the 2 parameters that we're most concerned with, because they have very direct and serious implications to survival and reproduction of salmon, are pH and dissolved oxygen, water temperature and dissolved oxygen. So you can see that pre-implementation, the water temperature was very high. Spawning temperatures really need to be below about 18 degrees Celsius in order for the eggs to survive, and in order for them to incubate, they should be below about 16 degrees Celsius. So you can see before and during implementation, we have water temperatures that far exceed that range that the salmon and their eggs can actually survive at. The water quality parameters after implementation on the November 5th sampling date show that these temperatures have lowered and the dissolved oxygen is a bit improved. And so this is showing that we have, pretty important changes in the water quality that's going to allow these salmon to survive. Now, to get back to the swamp protocols, this is also a suite of parameters that are important to benthic macroinvertebrates. So we're going to sort of switch gears and look at what's happening with them. So this is just looking at the relative abundance by family in our different plots. So on the left are our modified gravels, and on the right are our unmodified plots. And so you can see, just kind of at a snapshot here, that the modified benthic macroinvertebrate community is less diverse than the unmodified sites, and we'll get into some more detailed analyses of that. And there's also a greater proportion of certain families, certain orders. Dipterans and ephemeropterans are a little more abundant in the modified plots, whereas non-insects, plecopterans, and trichopterans are more abundant in the unmodified plots. So in this and then the following analyses, we've lumped the sites. Since we have upstream to down, we can sort of infer that these are all dependent upon each other. So just looking at differences in a few different metrics here. 8.8 on the graph here is the pre-manipulation monitoring data, and then project implementation took place between September 4th and 7th. And again, that was removal of rocks and then placement of clean washed materials that didn't contain any benthic macroinvertebrates or algae. For most of the metrics, the plots became similar by September 24th, but we can see that the p-value for many of these is significant, showing that there are differences overall. We have a couple of things that happened that may have influenced that. There were some major storm events that occurred. One storm event was on October 22nd, so we can see that some things start to shift a little bit on that October 26th date. And then on November 30th, there was a really major storm event in which the creek spiked from a normal run of about 10 CFS to over 13,000. That pretty much ended our monitoring season. This was no longer a wadable stream. Lots of things got flushed away, and so that's the end of our monitoring for this season. We looked at a couple of parameters just because we wanted to know exactly what was going on with the communities there. So individuals and IBI scores, and it's worth noting that the IBI scores here are out of a range of 40, and this is a Deer Creek family level IBI that we constructed and presented last year, so it's a little bit different than some of the IBIs you guys might be working with. We also saw differences in the number of orders and the number of distinct families by treatment. So we wanted to look at some diversity measures as well, so we looked at both Simpson's and Shannon's diversity. Simpson's diversity is more dependent on evenness, which is the abundance within families, while Shannon's diversity is more dependent on richness, so that's why we've stacked these two graphs on top of each other. Again, you can see that there's significant differences across all times for all but evenness, but we want to delve a little bit deeper and see, are some of these different storm events and other things that might have occurred during our sampling periods leading to this. Overall, we can see, though, that by about that third sampling event, communities are starting to overlap a little bit, and I have another graphic that'll depict that a little bit better. So one other way that we can look at this is by looking at Sorensen's distance, which this is just another diversity measurement or distance measurement, but lumping both unmodified and modified samples to get just one line on your graph. And so basically, as this approaches 1, it's saying that families are more different. As it gets closer to 0, it's saying that families are more similar. So we can see in our pre-sampling, they're very similar. We don't have any differences occurring really in the environment. But then immediately after our implementation, the families are very different with a score of over 0.8. Then as they start to sort of settle out, they get more and more similar until, again, this sort of late October, early November, when these storm events might be unsettling the communities a bit. So yet another way to look at this is by doing a non-metric multidimensional scaling. This is very appropriate for community data where you normally don't meet those normality requirements that you need for things like PCA. And basically what it's doing, it's taking all of our data, all of our families from all of our samples, it's throwing them up into multidimensional space, going through lots and lots of iterations, and then finding what is the simplest visual representation of your families. So each one of these symbols here is a data point. That's one sampling date in one either modified or unmodified plot. And very simply put, the closer these points are together, the more similar the samples are. The farther apart they are, the more different they are. So looking at this with this modified area being the large gray blob and the unmodified area being the smaller black blob, we can see that the modified area has really loose community structure. Families are all over the place. This is very well supported in the literature, showing that new communities, as they're kind of sorting themselves out, are not going to be very well tied to each other. They're going to be from a very wide array of organisms. And the fact that nearly the entire unmodified community is encompassed by this modified community can lead us to infer that organisms from that unmodified community are branching out and colonizing those newly placed gravels. It's also worth noting that these sites are graphed due to the interdependence of these sampling areas, and so we don't have sites 1, 2, and 3 showing any distinct patterns with their communities. And you can also see by some of these points way over on the edges that certain families are very closely associated with each axis. And so we're going to do future analyses to kind of see who are these families and what environmental variables, particularly with reference to water quality, might they be tracking. So as I mentioned, we really want to get your feedback. So the conclusions we can make at this point in time is that the modified gravels have been integrated into the system within the first 3 samples. Then they do seem to change a little bit, so we need to delve a little bit deeper and figure out why. It's worth mentioning that, yes, we used swamp protocols, but it was kind of a modification of both swamp and the protocols lined out in Mertz and Chan 2005. And that's because we're working in very small areas. We have 6x6 plots that we're sampling in, and so it's not really appropriate to do this reach-wide benthos type of sampling. And so we're kind of modifying with a mixture of the two. Our future analyses want to tease out these random effects. Are the storm events what's causing these communities to get distinctive? Is it just natural drift of communities as they kind of sort themselves out in these different habitat types? Or is there something else going on? The long-term success of this project, because we don't have any natural input of gravels, is definitely dependent on obtaining stable funding. And so a lot of these analyses are really important so that we can show success of our project to future funders. And the 2013 work, which we're just wrapping up right now, includes a lot of additional data collection. So we're doing algae sampling concurrent with macroinvertebrate sampling. We're looking at scour chains and painted tracer gravels to see how these things move through the system. We've got a lot of more detailed and more regular sampling that has occurred this season. So what we'd like from you, and Jeff hopefully will hop up here and help me answer any questions or filter any suggestions you have, is do you think we're using the appropriate protocols considering we have these small sample sizes? We're in a 1,400-foot reach of stream looking at 6 6x6 plots. Is the IBI the way to go? We thought maybe there would be a better way. We were thinking maybe the CSCI would be appropriate, but after Cindy's talk, maybe not so much because we're dealing with such a small area. And then are there any suggestions or comments to make this data amenable to future swamp scale work? Is this something that could be shared with other projects or utilized in different environments? So thank you.
If there's, could be immediate. Could have some, immediate questions or suggestions, or if you think it might, take a little bit more, time, you're going to be around the rest of the day. So there they are. They're going to be around the rest of the day. The Sierra Stream Institutes, they've been contributing all the time. It is a citizen monitoring group, and it's important what they do. So I hope that maybe you guys might take some time to talk to them. That's what this is also about, is dealing with people, projects, and trying to help, in future studies.
Thanks, Jim.
Unless there's some oh, there we go.
I'm going to ask probably an uninformed question. With that big of a storm event, how much of what you put in washed away?
That's a really good question, and it was less than we expected. Do you know numbers?
Sure.
Okay. I know that we were expecting pretty much full mortality of all reds and eggs within, but we did see juvenile salmon shortly after, and Jeff can probably address that better.
We had 3 transects of tracer gravels placed at the upstream site, and we expected everything to be completely gone, but we found our 2 most upstream tracer gravels. We found plenty of those at our lower work site, so they only migrated downstream about 1,400 meters or so, or 1,400 feet. And then we also still did keep finding remnants of eggs and fry and actually some par hanging out as well the following sampling season. So some of them did hang around and successfully kind of weather the storm. So